Thank you for watching African Elements. In this episode, we look at a first-hand account of the Middle Passage and what it tells us about this new refinement and cruelty, the likes of which have never before been seen in human history. We'll catch a glimpse of this experience and what it meant for millions of enslaved Africans, as well as why slavery apologists get it wrong. Up next. Welcome back to African Elements, where we bring classroom content to the people where you're at. Be sure to stick around to the end for our question of the day so that you can share your insights. The Middle Passage refers to the middle leg of the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas during the period of the Atlantic slave trade. I've often referred to the Atlantic slave trade as abysmal, in that the depths of brutality Africans experience can never be fully revealed. As Toni Morrison's cautioned, to do so is impossible. Language can never pin down slavery, genocide, war, nor should it yearn for the arrogance to be able to do so. Its force, its felicity, is in its reach toward the ineffable. Olaudah Equiano does offer us a rare insight into one person's ordeal. Equiano's narrative, published in the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African, provides a rare first-hand account of the Middle Passage from someone who actually experienced it. Recounting his experience as he was brought on board the slave ship bound for the Americas, he writes, "Soon after this, the blacks who brought me on board went off and left me abandoned to despair. I now saw myself deprived of all chance of returning to my native country, or even the least glimpse of hope of gaining the shore, which I now considered as friendly, and I even wished for my former slavery in preference to my present situation." This excerpt from Equiano's narrative reveals a lot about slavery in a global historical context. For one thing, it's clear that rival groups of West Africans participated with Europeans in the Atlantic slave trade, and it was they who brought him on board. What slavery apologists get wrong, though, is that they tend to suggest that Africans sold their own people into slavery. That simply wasn't the case. In his book, The Making of African America, The Four Great Migrations, Ira Berlin makes that clear through the words of a 19th century Dutch trader. "Not a few in our country fondly imagine that parents here sell their children, men their wives, and one brother the other, but those who think so deceive themselves." To further emphasize the point that those Africans who participated in the slave trade captured and sold people they considered separate and distinct from themselves, few, if any, designated themselves Africans. The slave trade itself, during the 17th and 18th century, transformed the many people of Africa, Angolans, Igbos, Congos, Minas, Mendes, and others, into Africans, and in time, African Americans. The other point that slavery apologists tend to get wrong is, well, Africans practiced slavery too. Returning to Equiano's narrative, it's clear that what he's experiencing on the Middle Passage is not the same as what he had experienced as a slave amongst West Africans. At one point, even stating that he would gladly trade places with that of the meanest slave in Africa. So, while the phenomenon of slavery is about as old as human civilization itself, slavery, as manifest on the Middle Passage, was a foreign experience to these enslaved Africans. To summarize, in sub-Saharan Africa, enslavement had been a dreaded misfortune, but not a catastrophe. Slaves were generally not critical to commerce or production, less a source of labor than of status and wealth. They mattered little to the organization of the state or society. Another sharp distinction is that slavery in West Africa was rarely intergenerational. In fact, it was often a means of incorporating outsiders into the family and community. Back to his account of the Middle Passage itself, Equiano continues, "I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I'd never experienced in my life. I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for my last friend, death, to relieve me. But soon to my grief, 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by the hands while the other flogged me severely. I had never experienced anything of this kind before, and although not being used to the water, could I have gotten over the nettings, I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely who were not chained down to the decks, lest we should leap into the water. And I've seen some of these poor African prisoners most severely cut for attempting to do so, and hourly whipped for not eating. One day, when we had smooth sea and moderate wind, 2 of my wearied countrymen who were chained together, preferring death to such a life of misery, somehow made through the nettings and jumped into the sea. Immediately, another quite dejected fellow also followed their example, and I believe many more would have soon done the same if they had not been prevented by the ship's crew, who were instantly alarmed. In addition to Equiano's narrative, the particular hardships women faced in the Middle Passage is well documented. Captive women faced special dangers. Although rarely shackled and often housed above deck, enslaved women found themselves prostituted to their captors. Olaudah Equiano, who endured the Middle Passage in the 18th century, recalled that it was common for the dirty, filthy sailors to take African women and lie upon their bodies. The Atlantic slave trade was devastating on many levels. In terms of sheer scale, probably the most reliable estimates range from about 9 to 11 million Africans taken to the Americas through the Middle Passage. Mortality estimates also vary widely depending upon several variables. For one thing, the death rate decreased toward the latter half of the Atlantic slave trade. Additionally, the length of the voyage varied widely as slavers often visited many West African ports to fill their holds with human cargo before heading to the Americas. Also, after crossing the Atlantic, they often traveled to several ports, peddling slaves in small lots. As a result, their time on the slave ships in the Middle Passage could vary from weeks to months. Death came at various stages between Africa and the Americas. The death marches from the interior where they were captured to the coast where they awaited sale to European slavers took a devastating toll. According to some estimates, between seizure, march, and detention to the barracoons on the West African coast, up to 50% died before ever reaching the slave ships. Of the survivors, another 12 to 25% perished on the Middle Passage. Of those who survived the Middle Passage, still another 20 to 30% died during the dreaded seasoning process, a brutal 2-year period in which slaves acculturated to new life and work routine of the Americas. As a part of this process, slaves were given new names and the language and religion were literally beaten out of them. As we saw previously, Africans responded by modifying their religion, disguising it so that it could be practiced under the guise of European religion. Those new modes of worship, Vodou, Santeria, Candomblé, and others, became the backbone of resistance and slave rebellion. Nevertheless, under certain conditions, scarcely 12% of those who left the continent were still alive by the end of the seasoning process. Seasoned slaves and Creoles, second-generation Africans who were born in the Americas, had better prospects for long-term survival. For that reason, they were worth 3 times the value of unseasoned new Africans. So the sheer numbers took a huge toll on the continent in general, and West Africa in particular. Compounding the great disaster, or the Mafa as it's known in Swahili, was the fact that age-grade societies were common in West Africa. The cultural practice of organizing society into specific age sets with designated roles usually accompanied rites of passage and elaborate rituals that marked the transition from one age set to another. In the film The Color Purple, for example, there's a scene in which Celia is about to shave Mr. As she's sharpening the blade, the scene is intercut with her children undergoing ritual scarification in Africa. Each age set carries some social significance, but collectively, it's these age sets that bind society together. So not only was the Middle Passage devastating in terms of sheer numbers, but the concentrated removal of primarily males from the 14 to 28 age sets threw West African societies into a state of chaos. The late West African author Chinua Achebe captured that critical historical moment in his novel, appropriately titled Things Fall Apart. In it, we see the process in motion as the removal of entire age sets throws West African society into catastrophic societal collapse. Because each age set is built on the others, places like Brazil were able to maintain continuity of African culture more so than the continent of Africa itself. In fact, until recently, people from West Africa studying traditional West African religion studied it across the Atlantic in Brazil. So, in this episode, we barely waded into the abyss. But what are your thoughts about what we discussed so far? How would you address the damage caused by the Middle Passage, to say nothing of 400 years of enslavement that followed? How might you go about repairing that damage? That's a huge question for those pursuing a critical reparations agenda. There are many different thoughts on how to address reparations, so please do contribute your insights in the comments below. That's it for this episode. To all my Patreon subscribers, I can't thank you enough for your support. If you'd like to support this program, there's a link to my Patreon page where you can get access to ad-free content and other educational materials. Otherwise, a like and subscribe would also be greatly appreciated. I'm Darius Spearman. Until next time, I'll see you in the comments.